friends of the museum. I welcome you all. Well, good afternoon. It's really great that you are here today because the weather was awful and you all made it. So that is really fantastic. We appreciate that. And I welcome you all to this very special event. The first annual Kent Russell Lecture. Right, there, yes, very good. This lecture was established by Edward and Zoe Russell, and with additional funds from the Langton family for educational programming. We are very, very proud and grateful that you're here. A special welcome, of course, to Kent and Aisling. Where are you, Aisling? Oh, you're there. Okay, good. Oh, far back. And Susan and Lauren, husband, son, who I met today. Great that you're all here. This lecture was established in Kent's name. And Kent is a special person, of course. He is my illustrious predecessor, and he has accomplished a lot for our museum, for this very unique place. There's so many things. One of the things that stands out is the, well, he managed to get the museum AAM accredited. And AAM is the American Alliance of Museums. And, well, it's a mark of distinction. It's a very special thing. He did that in a record period of time. And there's about just 10% of all museums in the United States of America that have this accreditation. So I think, thank you, Ken, that is very great. And it is true, this is a very special, a unique place. This is the only icon museum in the United States of America dedicated to icons and Eastern Christian art. A very, very special place. And we are working hard on this place. We are strengthening our position, working on the future together with the board, with the team, with internal, external stakeholders, the community, members, docents. And I think that we have a bright future. Icons are this whole world is totally fascinating and intriguing, and we are going to strengthen and show this whole world of Russian icons into the broader context of Eastern Christian art. We are going to embrace the whole world of Eastern Christian art. I'm working hard on it together with all the stakeholders, and I'm enjoying that. Kent. We all know Kent, a born optimist, a man who loves good food, a good glass of wine, I would rather say a bottle, and he is a social animal. He has great, I would rather say, sometimes grand ideas, and I very recently witnessed the critical role that Aisling plays in, managing all this and bringing Ken back to his senses and putting his feet back on the ground. That's a tough job. I respect for that. That is a part of Ken, but there's another part too, and that is he's a man with an intellectual mind. He's very much interested in art. All things cultural, music, history, a very broad interest, and always interested in broadening his horizon. And that is exactly, it's a nice bridge, I think, actually, that what we are here for today is broadening our horizon, because Dr. Sciacca is here today with us, and she's going to talk about Ethiopian art, the ancient churches, totally intriguing and fascinating churches, icons, frescoes, Christine, I'm so happy that you're here, and we were very, glad and proud that you accepted our invitation. And in order to introduce you properly, and then to read your very impressive biography, and I need my glasses for that. Let me see. Dr. Christine Sciacca is Curator of European Art at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. Walters Art Museum. Used to be the gallery. Yes, sure. She received her PhD, her Master in Philosophy and Master of Arts in Art History from Columbia University, and a BA in Art History from Cornell University. Previously, Christine was curator of illuminated manuscripts at the Getty Museum for 10 years, and she has worked at several other museums, including the Met Cloisters and the British Library. Her research concentrates on Italian, German, and here we are, Ethiopian medieval art, with a focus on liturgy, devotional practice, and patronage. Her book publications include Building the Medieval World and Illuminating Women in the Medieval World. Her international loan exhibition and accompanying catalogue, Florence at the Dawn of the Renaissance, Painting and Illumination, 1300-1350, appeared at the Getty Museum and the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto in 2012. She is currently developing the exhibition Ethiopia at the Crossroads, opening at the Walters Art Museum in December 2023, at the end of this year, which will travel to the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. Good for us, so more or less around the corner. You have to go and see it. And the Toledo Museum of Art. The exhibition has received both a planning grant and an implementation grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the inaugural exhibition development grant from the International Center of Medieval Art and the Samuel Kress Foundation. Please welcome me, join me in welcoming Dr. Christine.
I get to find my PowerPoint. Or I could just talk in front of this slide. I can sort of, act it out for you. Okay, come on. Okay. So first, a great thank you to Simon right here who invited me to speak. I'm happy to say first, became acquainted with each other through a symposium actually here, sponsored by the Museum of Russian Icons back in, I believe, June 2020. Which was meant to be in person, some of you might remember that, and in fact wound up being virtual. So we've seen each other on the screen and now a few times in real life, and so it's so wonderful to be here to actually see the collection here. I've had an incredible past 2 days walking around. I'm also, am I getting a little bit of feedback here? I hear some whistling. I'll ignore it. And I also learned, actually from another colleague here from the Museum of Russian Icons, that primarily their registrar, Laura, that we had, there's an incredible collection of Ethiopian art here, and some of you might be aware of that. I know Kent certainly is, and I'm so pleased and privileged to have you here tonight that I got the opportunity to see all of it in storage, and I hope that it might too join the icons in the galleries here. Simon and I were talking about the fact, and I'll show you this, that I think the direction that might be headed here is very similar to how we display Russian icons, Ethiopian art, Armenian, Georgian, Greek, Orthodox art in the Walters Art Museum all together, rather than Ethiopian art being allied with African art. So I think we kind of are uniquely displaying it in that way, but maybe it won't be so unique down the road. So in any case, thank you to all of you. I've met so many wonderful colleagues here. Many thanks also to Amy Consalvi for paving the way, and to Melanie Trottier for really just welcoming me here and making everything such a smooth process. So So pleased to be with you here tonight, and thank you all for coming out in the rain. Personally, I would not personally come out in the rain or something like this, so it's not good on the hair. So thank you all for making it out and not going to the Taylor Swift concert that I heard is just down the road. So what I'd like to present to you this afternoon is an exhibition that I've been working on throughout the past 5 years. In fact, I pitched the idea for this show during my interview at the Walters. And I like to say that's kind of why they hired me. my boss, my director, tells me that's not the case, but I think that it is, and I'll explain a little bit why. I first became interested in Ethiopian art actually in graduate school, and it's now kind of almost an embarrassing story. I was a medievalist, so Simon gave me a bit of an upgrade. He said I was the curator of European art at the Walters. I'm actually the curator of European art 300 to 1400 CE. And all that means is I'm the curator of medieval objects. So I was a happy medievalist going to Columbia, learning all about illuminated manuscripts and mostly kind of focusing on Germany, but learning really the whole, I thought, history of illuminated manuscripts. And, requirement to take some area of art outside my field, so I chose African art, and I entered in this incredible survey taught by Zoe Strother about African art. And we got kind of into the unit and started to go along, and she presented a unit on Ethiopia, and she put some illuminated manuscripts up on the screen from Ethiopia concurrent with the ones that I was studying, gospel books, and my mind was completely blown. So what I'm happy to say is now, 20 years later, Ethiopian art, and specifically Ethiopian medieval art, is now being integrated by many professors at different universities, not just Africanists, but also medieval European art professors as well. So, but at the time, it was an incredible revelation for me, and it really helped connect really everything that I saw happening in the world of illuminated manuscripts. So this was kind of my pitch when I showed up at the Walters, and now here we are 5 years later, and it's finally coming to fruition. So the exhibition, as Simon mentioned, is called Ethiopia at the Crossroads, and it's opening December 3rd at the Walters Art Museum, and I'll come back to the full dates a little bit later on. The exhibition will have approximately 225 objects, drawn largely from the Walters collection, but also with many domestic and international loans. And I want to just thank, I have this up here, Michael Gervers, who's an incredible professor at the University of Toronto, who has traveled extensively through Ethiopia during his career and photographed as much as he possibly could. So this is a wonderful photo that he took of the monastery of Gunde in Ethiopia. It kind of lies on the border between modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, and you can sort of get a little snapshot of the area that the art is coming from that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. We have what are known as the Christian highlands of Ethiopia. You can see that, this incredibly high elevation. This particular monastery is kind of cut right into the side of the mountain. There are the Simeon Mountains National Park is also in this area, and having visited that, I have not visited Gunde, but visiting that national park, it's kind of like the Grand Canyon on steroids. That's the best way I can describe it from my American standpoint. So imagine all of this art kind of coming out of this area and being produced in some cases at the monasteries, in some cases in the courts of some of the different that kind of moved around northern Ethiopia. And as I'm sort of talking about these objects, which are obviously not now in this original context. So for any of you who have not been to the Walters Art Museum, this is what our Ethiopian art looks like at the very top of the screen there. We have it in kind of a octagonal gallery at the very center of the medieval galleries. And like I said, it's paired with objects, for example, you see that Armenia Kachkar there. We have some, just beyond that, we have some Byzantine ivories. Like I said, there's also Russian icons to the right of this shot that I took there. And at the very center of this gallery we have Ethiopian icons and those processional crosses, metalwork processional crosses that you see in the center there. We don't always have a jazz band playing in there, but I couldn't resist sharing a really wonderful event we did. It's a program we have called Art Sound Now, and we invite performers, local musicians to come and pick a gallery to play in. They can pick anything they want, whatever speaks to them. And this particular group, known as Polarity, they're out of Washington, D.C., they saw the Ethiopian art and also had their minds blown. They actually perform with Ethiopian jazz musicians in Washington quite frequently. And so they had no idea that Ethiopia had a visual arts culture at all. So they really wanted to play in this space, and it really transformed, I think, how we kind of perceive our own art collection. So I couldn't resist sharing that. Here is one of our diptych icons by a follower of Fede Seon. I'll come back to him a little bit. And the Walters really got started with its sort of involvement in Ethiopian art back in 1993, so actually 30 years ago, with a show called African Zion. And maybe some of you are familiar with this show. It actually traveled to about 7 venues across the United States, and it originated with the Walters Art Museum. And it was really the first time that Ethiopian art was introduced in this really extensive way to American audiences. After that point, we actually at that point had only had one object of Ethiopian art in our collection. It was a cross collected by our founder, Henry Walters, and he actually collected it thinking that it was a Coptic Egyptian cross. It was not. It was in fact Ethiopian, so he was an accidental collector of Ethiopian art. And after this African Zion show, we began to be gifted Ethiopian art. We started to purchase some Ethiopian art, and today we have about 225 objects in this area of our collection, which might actually not, I should say, they range from coins from ancient Aksum in Ethiopia. We have metalwork crosses, icons, manuscripts, wall paintings, and so forth. And this might, these objects date from about the 3rd century CE to the 20th century. So this might not sound like a lot of objects, but it represents about 1/6 of our own medieval collection that I oversee. So it's quite significant, actually. And also, it is one of the largest collections of Ethiopian art outside of Ethiopia. Let's see. Do I advance? Okay. So this exhibition, while incredibly groundbreaking and really, I think, revelatory for a lot of American audiences who are not familiar with Ethiopian art, it really treated Ethiopia in a very isolated way. So, very much talking about the art that was produced there, but not explaining all the incredible contacts it had with its surrounding cultures. So what I'm trying to do with the Ethiopia at the Crossroads show is really to show that relationship that Ethiopia had with the various cultures it came into contact with throughout its history. The idea is to start with the Walters collection, which is global in its scope, so not just Ethiopian art from the Walters, but from all over the region, and talking about the impact of Ethiopian art across the Red Sea, across the Mediterranean, even crossing the Indian Ocean as well, and also within Africa at the same time. It will cover, I want to say, maybe about 3,000 years of history. So at this point, you probably think I've lost my marbles, and you would be right. But it really, I thought, necessary to really explain this sort of very long history of Ethiopia and all of its richness. And so here, I borrowed this map from a catalog out of the Art Institute of Chicago. You can see, just geographically, I think it's really important to look at Ethiopia's location. And I'm going to try to step over wires here. So we have Ethiopia right here, if you're not familiar with its location. So you have it here right in the East Africa, the Horn of Africa, very, very close to the Arabian Peninsula, had a lot of relationships there. Obviously also the Nile comes all the way down into Ethiopia, so up to Egypt and sort of across the Mediterranean Sea through that avenue. And also we'll talk about those contacts across the Indian Ocean. I'll talk about the later ones, but this also went back quite far in history, that it had relationships across that body of water as well. And by the way, I just want to point out these trade routes and these routes of travel. You can sort of see that it's almost this kind of fulcrum, and everything is kind of circulating around it. You have, for example, Armenian traders coming down into Ethiopia, and travelers coming from Europe pass through that way, Ethiopians traveling outward. So it's, I know my big medieval soapbox is, I think today we don't perceive medieval people as having traveled very much. Certainly it was arduous, it was painful, it was expensive, but people did travel for various reasons, whether it be their faith or their desire for, economic exchange, but in fact, or political means, but in fact, there was quite a lot of travel and exchange throughout the Middle Ages. And I should say too, Ethiopians went not just to Europe, places like Rome. They went to often these centers of Christianity. So Rome, they also went to Jerusalem as well and lived side by side with other members of other Christian faiths, also Jews and Muslims as well. And we'll come back to all of this. Okay. The other big impetus for this exhibition is, in fact, Baltimore and its own local community. So some of you might know that we have, in fact, we call it the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, we have the largest Ethiopian and Ethiopian American population, not just in our country, but in the world. So this directly speaks to our local community and just trying to, make that connection. I think all museums are really trying to do that today. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is to kind of give you a little bit of a walkthrough of the exhibition. This is by no means a comprehensive, I'm not going to show you 225 slides, you're relieved to know that. This is not a comprehensive look at every object in the show, but to kind of give you a little snippet of the different themes that you'll see as you enter. And I had a bit of a challenge because I really wanted to kind of tell the chronological history of Ethiopia and all of its various points of contact it had throughout its history. But I also acknowledge that many people don't know much about Ethiopian art or Ethiopian history at all. So the first part of the exhibition is kind of a little précis. It's like a little toolbox for people to take, understand the basics of Ethiopian culture and history, and to take that with them moving forward into the exhibition. So the first place to start is its really long, old history, the earliest points of its history, which actually start with an individual known as the Queen of Sheba. So the Queen of Sheba was associated with many different countries throughout her history and the stories that were told about her, but really came to be solidified in her association with Ethiopia. And as the story goes, this is a legend that was actually only written down in Ethiopian language in the 13th century, and actually only depicted in artwork really in the 20th century, even though the stories are quite well known and all Ethiopians know this story and people outside of Ethiopia know this story. You have actually two very similar types of paintings to this right here at the Museum of Russian Icons. This is the Walters example that we have. This is a painting on canvas that was probably painted for tourists coming into Ethiopia starting around 1930, 1940. This one's probably from maybe 1950. And you can see we have this kind of serial narrative telling the story of Queen of Sheba, kind of starting in the upper left, running down the row, and then row after that. So the story of the Queen of Sheba is that she had heard tales of the great King Solomon in Israel. And she eventually decided that she wanted to travel to meet this great King Solomon. And so she did so with a huge retinue, and she went to his court, and he welcomed her and showed her around, and they had these incredible conversations. And she was a very intelligent queen, and he sort of was captivated by that, but also kind of fell for her as well. And so she had no interest in that whatsoever, but he said, since you're here, let me serve you this incredible banquet. And, please stay, and we'll give you this incredible feast, and, this is the least we can do. We've traveled all this way. And she says, okay, fine. So he says, I will offer you all this. You can stay here. You can have this banquet. But if you take anything of mine from my kingdom, I get to have relations with you. So you can see where this is going. So he serves her this incredible banquet, this incredible meal, and he has the food highly salted. And so the banquet is over. She goes off to the bedchamber that's been prepared for her. And Solomon has a jug of water left on her bedside table. And she goes to sleep, and she wakes up in the middle of the night, and she's so thirsty from this incredibly salty meal that he served. And so she serves herself some water. And he leaps in at that moment and says, aha, you took something of mine. Now I get to sleep with you. Right. Lovely guy. So anyway, the result of this is that she conceives a child who is named Menelik, and Menelik actually gets reincarnated later as an emperor in the 19th century, so to speak. But she goes back to Ethiopia, gives birth to Menelik, and then as he becomes into his adulthood, he really wants to meet his father. Now, King Solomon thinks this is wonderful and welcomes him back for a visit with open arms. And he's having a wonderful time. He meets his father, his whole court, and he eventually says to him, I'm getting a little homesick. I really want to go home. And Solomon says, okay, I get it. I'll give you some of my best courtiers to go back with you, and you'll be safe on your travels, and so forth and so on. So you can already see the travel happening, right, back and forth, quite early on. So in the dead of night, they decide to set out on their journey, and the courtiers of King Solomon, though, they're also going to miss something. They're going to miss the Ark of the Covenant that's in Israel. So they decide, as the story goes, to take the Ark of the Covenant and bring it with them back to Ethiopia. So to this day, there is a church in the city of Aksum in northern Ethiopia, which was the ancient capital of Ethiopia, that has a church that is said to contain the Ark of the Covenant, the actual tablets, Moses' tablets. The Ark of the Covenant is guarded by one monk, and then when he passes on, another one takes over. Nobody can enter the space except for that one individual. And this is this incredible foundation story that is so important to the sort of origins of Ethiopia as we know it. So the exhibition kind of begins with this story and also nods to aspects such as Lucy, so the earliest Australopithecus who was found in Ethiopia, so sort of the origins of mankind in Ethiopia as well. So it's really quite remarkable. I had the wonderful opportunity to go to Ethiopia in January of 2020. Right before the world fell apart, and just to see these sites where the Queen of Sheba's palace and all of these various sorts of places are marked out in Ethiopia. The authenticity knows, but the history is palpable as you travel through Ethiopia. So hope to share a little bit with you about that today. So one thing to understand, very important thing to understand, and Simon mentioned this sort of Eastern Orthodox Christianities, and that Ethiopia is a part of that. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity is something definitely I think may come as a surprise to some visitors, and some visitors who are familiar with the Christian tradition. I had no idea that they would associate this, but when I'm talking about this art to some audiences, they immediately assume that the Christianity is a result of colonialism, and that's in fact the complete opposite of the case. So Ethiopia and the Ethiopian emperor, King Azana of Ethiopia, actually adopted Christianity in the early part of the 4th century CE in Ethiopia. It was the second oldest Christian nation after Armenia, although sometimes they like to duke it out. They're quite close in when they adopted Christianity. And so it's really important to sort of explain that a lot of the that we have at the Walters was collected because it in fact is the Christian art of Ethiopia. And just showing you a couple of examples of what you might see in that context. We have some of the crosses. The one on the right-hand side is my favorite processional cross in the Walters Art Museum. That was one of the ones you saw in the photo of our galleries. I love this one because the interlace, you can see several distinct sort of Greek-style cross throughout the overall cross. But every time that interlace crosses itself, you get another cross. So I sat down one time and actually counted this out, and I think it's something like 65 crosses are contained within this one cross. So you can see that real importance of the cross in Ethiopian art. The other form of cross that you see quite frequently is this hand cross here, and this is kind of a somewhat unusual example where the shaft of the cross is actually the body of a human being. And every priest, Ethiopian Orthodox priest, must have a cross of his own. And so they would hold it sort of around that middle part there. They could bless individuals. The faithful could kiss the cross. And then you see also there's yet another sort of interlaced cross at the top. And this square right at the bottom here, you'll see in all Ethiopian hand crosses, including the ones here at the Museum of Russian Icons. And that square actually represents the Ark of the Covenant, those tablets, that reminder. I said that the Ark of the Covenant was in this one particular church, but any church in Ethiopia, in order to be sanctified, has to have a replica of the Ark of the Covenant known as a tabot. So, and that is sort of a mini tabot that every priest kind of carries around with him. So just because the Walters has collected only the Christian art of Ethiopia, this is where I start to fill in the gaps of the much broader production in Ethiopia. So Islam came very early to Ethiopia during the time of Muhammad, actually. There were exiles, Muslim exiles from Saudi Arabia that got sent to Ethiopia and were welcomed there. And so the community, the Muslim community there is very, very old, going right back to the beginnings of Islam. And while we aren't actually able to represent this in our own collection, hopefully, cross your fingers, this is like the last loan I'm waiting to hear on, is this alum from the British Museum. This is a processional standard, and so you can kind of think of it in concert with those processional crosses, kind of had a similar function in a religious ceremony. And this was actually, you'll find alums from really the entire Islamic world, but this particular one is actually from Ethiopia and from a place called Harar, which is in the eastern part of Ethiopia, and the real sort of seat of Islam, and has been sort of for many centuries. On the right-hand side, what I can show, however, is we're not exactly sure where from, an African Quran we have in the Walters collection, and just to kind of show, in a way, the kind of kickoff of Islam is in part coming from the Ethiopian region, in the kickoff to all of Africa, and I think some of the decorative motifs in that manuscript actually respond really well to things like the alam that I show here. No images of this. Also, Ethiopian Jews have had a long history in Ethiopia. Some think that actually Ethiopians were practicing a form of Judaism before the arrival of Christianity. Again, this connection back to King Solomon. Some of you might know the history of Ethiopian Jews. Many were airlifted. In fact, almost all were airlifted in several campaigns out of Ethiopia to Israel. So there's communities of Ethiopian Jews mostly in Israel today. And I will have some examples of the artworks they produced as well. Again, all on loan. And also just to show the broader picture, so I've talked about the importance, the long history of the three Abrahamic faiths in Ethiopia, but also there are many other types of belief systems in especially southern Ethiopia. And I have, we have two of these so-called Konso figures, or figures from the Konso culture. These are grave markers for important individuals. We'll have both a male figure who would be sort of the, his grave, and then usually his wife, this is the female figure, would be represented, and then several other figures as well, kind of showing the extent of his retinue. These date to the 19th century. These might, as you look at them, they're wood sculptures. They might in fact remind you of other types of sculpture you've seen from other parts of Africa. So, quite often Ethiopian art is seen as quite different from, other African art, but of course, African art is not a monolith, but this might help you sort of connect with some of the sculptural traditions that you might see in other parts of Africa. And the final section in the sort of intro section of the show is talking about Ethiopic language. So some of you might be familiar with the term Ge'ez, that is what classical Ethiopic is typically called. This is a language that actually has Semitic origins and origins in South Arabian language. So this is, again, one of those imports that came across the Arabian Sea and got developed, the Red Sea, and also the Arabian Sea, and got developed in Ethiopia. It becomes incredibly important, this very early writing system. So we're talking about, I think it's really kind of laid down in 3rd, 4th century. We have some earlier examples. It becomes incredibly important, obviously, in the texts that are written. It becomes important in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. That's kind of how it's used today, is in the liturgy mostly. It's kind of a bit like Latin. So it's a language that is mostly just spoken in the church context and not really too much outside. But it does appear not just in manuscripts, but also in, for example, icons. So I don't know if you can see this. It's quite small, but this is one of our Ethiopian triptych icons. And we've got inscriptions throughout in Ge'ez identifying all the figures that are here. So this is this incredibly close relationship between text and image in Ethiopian art. And you're probably wondering what's going on over there. This is how we get to the 20th century. So this is a painting by the artist Hossein Khosrow. He's based in Berkeley now, but he was born and trained as an artist in Ethiopia at the famous art school associated with Addis Ababa University. And he too is taken with this idea of text and playing with it. Now, it's obviously a very abstract painting. He's actually also influenced by jazz music, for example. We brought up the importance of jazz music in Ethiopia. But this is actually, you might be able to pick out, for example, there's these Ge'ez characters, which is also the same alphabet used in modern day Amharic, and that's what the majority of Ethiopians speak, although there's many, many languages in Ethiopia. And he's sort of, fragmented the letters, but also you can pick out little phrases here and there. And this painting is called Wax and Gold. And it refers to this Ethiopian concept, and I'm going to do a very basic job of explaining it, but the idea that there's sort of anything that somebody says has sort of the surface meaning, that's the wax. And then if you really dig deeper, you get to that gold part, the real meaning of what's being said. So he has several paintings with this title, and like I said, so he's, and you know, I'm not just making this up, like he told me that he's actually basing it upon artwork such as this, where you have that text image together. This is also the indication that we're going to have some contemporary art in this show. So what I've tried to do is select some artists who are working today or worked in the 20th century who are really responding to historic Ethiopian art in the work. And so Wosene is one great example of that, but we'll have several others throughout the show, and putting them side by side as you see them here. Rather than sort of, you know, having all the contemporary art at the end, they will be interspersed throughout. So South Arabia, so this is kind of where we enter into these relationships that Ethiopia had with other cultures. We talked about South Arabia before in terms of the language. You can see some South Arabian down here. Some of the characters are then picked up in Ge'ez. And we have some of these wonderful alabasters here. I just saw another one at the Worcester Art Museum this afternoon. We have an incredible collection of these at the Walters. You have the language connection there, but also I think iconographically and the way that, for example, animals are portrayed, there must have been sort of some of, in fact, I know that you find these objects in Ethiopian museums as well, so very clear that these things were being transported very early on. They were found in archaeological digs in Ethiopia, so this is not like a recent thing. And I really like to pair it with this incredible manuscript we have up here from the Walters, from Gunde Gunde, that monastery I showed you in the beginning. If you look at the way the animals are depicted here, I think, and even the compartmentalization of the page, I think is really taking a lot from this awareness of South Arabian art, which is much, much earlier. And also, I should say, for example, the ram that you see at the very center there, that is an animal that is not really indigenous to that area of what's known today as Yemen, but it is indigenous to Egypt, Ethiopia, and so forth. So even that awareness of those animal forms is kind of going back and forth. Rome and Nubia. So at that time where we have King Ezana, and even before King Ezana, these rulers of the Aksumite Empire in northern Ethiopia, we have this moment where, of course, this is coming right at the end of sort of the Roman Empire, and also just this awareness of, you know, what those sort of local empires had produced. So the Nubian Empire, just to the north of Ethiopia, the Roman Empire that reached into North Africa, and you have at the top there, it's actually one coin, that's the front and the back. So the Aksumite kings, as a result, began to mint their own coinage, starting in the 3rd century. And it's a wonderful example. It's some of the earliest materials we have at the Walters and in the exhibition. And it's a really good marker of what was happening in Ethiopia at that time, because the coinage begins with the symbol of the crescent and the disc on it, which is actually a South Arabian symbol. And then around the time of the adoption of Christianity, that symbol disappeared to be replaced by the cross that you see there on the back of that particular coin. And that starts with King Ezana. You can actually see early Ezana coins have the crescent and the disc, and then it shifts over to the cross in the later part of his reign. And just generally, I hope to show all these sorts of things together, this idea that you're also kind of tracking the concept of portraiture through these coins, kind of starting with ancient Nubia, with Rome, and then these Aksumite rulers starting in the 3rd century CE. Very close connections with Coptic Egypt. You know, Henry Walters, I can't totally fault him because people all the time interchange Coptic Christianity and Ethiopian Christianity. They're obviously neighbors, and also I won't go into the full story of the arrival of Christianity in Ethiopia, but in the beginning, of course, they did not have any sort of patriarch, they had no bishop, nothing like that. And so as Christianity began to grow, the leader of Ethiopia, in fact, King Ezana, appealed to the patriarch in Alexandria in Egypt and said, you know, we need some leadership here. And he sends this monk Frumentius to sort of make the case, and the Coptic patriarch says, okay, Frumentius, you're the bishop. Go back to Ethiopia. He's like, no, I didn't mean that. No, you're the bishop. Okay, so he goes back. And then you have this connection with the Coptic church and the Ethiopian church that extends up to 1958. So it was only in 1958 that Ethiopia became independent from, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church became independent from the Coptic Orthodox Church. and sort of had its own patriarch. So show you here two Coptic manuscripts. One is from the Walters collection on the right, and one leaf from the Getty Museum on the left, to give you a sense of sort of the manuscript culture coming out of Coptic Egypt, and again, these really strong connections between those two churches. Armenia. I mentioned Armenia before because obviously they're both two early Christian nations. Trade was happening very early on between these countries, and so I show you on the right an Armenian gospel book, one of the oldest Armenian gospel books in the U.S. On the right from the Walters. And this is a canon table, so it's basically a concordance of the four Gospels that you find at the beginning of any Gospel book, no matter where it comes from. And then on the right, from about 500 years later, an Ethiopian manuscript in our collection. It's canon tables. And I think you can see a lot of similarities in terms of the decorative motifs, the animal forms that are used. Again, these are quite far apart in time, but there's this awareness, these things were circulating. Manuscripts are portable, so all these types of motifs can be transported through small-scale objects, through manuscripts, and so forth. I should also point out that even today, there is an Armenian quarter in Addis Ababa. So these connections are quite long-ranging and still survive today. So as Christianity kind of grew, beginning with the sort of acceptance of Christianity by King Ezana in the 4th century. We kind of go through the Aksumite Empire. That kind of falls around the 7th century, early part of the 8th century. And then you have a little bit of a gap, but then you start to have this incredible church building happening in Ethiopia. And I'm going to jump ahead because I'm going to show you something that if any of you know anything about Ethiopian art and architecture, you might be familiar with these incredible rock-cut churches. This is the most famous of them in a place called Lalibela. It's a complex of about 12 churches there. This is kind of just the most famous. These churches are cut out of the living rock, sort of you kind of walk along the surface there, and then you have to kind of come around one corner, and then you go down a ramp, and you wind up at the base right there of that church, and then you can enter the church from there. So this is carved from the top down, incredible feat. And this is happening around the 12th, 13th centuries. Anytime you build a bunch of churches, you all know this, you need all of the liturgical objects, you need the text to be able to perform liturgy in these spaces. And so this is when we have the earliest manuscripts from Ethiopia that survive or produced during this period, especially the illuminated ones. So we have here an example from the Walters. This is actually from the 14th century. This is, again, one of the earliest Ethiopian manuscripts illuminated that survives. And so we'll have this on view with some incredible images at the beginning of this gospel book. Again, we'll come back to that gospel book idea. It's also at that time that some of those processional crosses get to be made, and some of the early hand crosses as well. Jumping forward to the 15th century, you start to have Ethiopia sort of venture out into the European realm, sending envoys as early as the beginning of the 15th century to places like Spain, places like Italy, those countries sending envoys back to Ethiopia. And so you get this exchange, and often what you see in the historical records, and a scholar known as Verena Krebs, she has done a lot of work on this recently, reading these archival documents, and these Ethiopian envoys were, when they went and they were being given gifts, the things that they were really, hoping for were icons, liturgical objects. These are the things that are recorded that they brought back from places like Europe. And we don't actually know what they brought in return, but her theory, and I think it's a good one, is that they brought ivory, gold, all these very precious materials that they knew the Europeans wanted and wanted to use in their artwork. And so that's probably how that exchange went. No use of ivory, no use of gold leaf in Ethiopian art, even though there are direct indigenous sources of them in Ethiopia. So something to think about. So on the screen here, I show you two different paintings of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. And we have here on the left an example by an artist known as Fere Seyon. I showed you at the very beginning that diptych, that's sort of his school that's at the Walters. He is an Ethiopian artist, so we know worked at the court of King Ezana. And on the right-hand side, a contemporary painting by the workshop of Bartolomeo Vivarini, a Venetian artist, almost exactly the same, or very close, I should say. I think you can see there's a lot of similarities here in terms of the composition, the interaction between mother and child. And so what has often been told in the past about this connection is that, oh, the Italians came in, they brought their icons, the Italian artists showed up in Ethiopia, and then the Ethiopians started painting icons. Well, we need to unthink that. It is true that icon painting began around this time in the 15th century in Ethiopia. However, I think you can see that the Ethiopian artist is very much taking these themes and running with them in a very unique direction that's particular to Ethiopia. So the incredible pattern designs. You have always in these icons the archangels Gabriel and Michael guarding the Virgin with swords. You also have here these inscriptions, again in Ge'ez, very clearly on Christ, on this mirror here, on the Virgin herself. And so really what we're trying to get out with this exhibition is to show that sort of back and forth exchange. And you'll see also in the show icons by Italian artists who worked in Ethiopia. So I think you'll see that gets to be incredibly interesting. I mentioned briefly before the idea that Ethiopians were also going to places like Jerusalem, where you have many, many communities there from different areas, different religions, different types of Christianity, while also having the exhibition a printed copy of Bernhard von Bredenbach's text that he wrote about these different cultures that were in in Jerusalem. He recorded the rest of all these different cultures, and he also recorded their language. So this is actually the first non-Ethiopian recording of Ge'ez, actually translated into sort of German-ish, but certainly into non-Ethiopic characters. And so just this idea that all these cultures were actually side by side in those places. So Armenians next to Ethiopians, next to Greek monks, this sort of thing. And on the right-hand side there, we've got, I think it's we have a priest and we have a secular individual on the far right, and they're sort of their dress as Bredenbach had it sort of recorded. So moving later in time and talking about travel and interaction, along with the sort of diplomatic missions between Europe and Ethiopia, you also have groups such as the Jesuits who are traveling obviously to evangelize. They travel down through into Ethiopia, try to convert the Ethiopians to Catholicism, and they say, thanks, we're already Christian, we don't need your Catholicism. They actually physically kick them out. The Jesuits continue on to India, to places like Goa on the west coast of India. And I show you here a Goan ivory that we have depicting the Madonna of the Immaculate Conception. And I had a real revelation with this, and you'll see this in the catalog. Unfortunately, it can't be in the show. But this particular example, you look at the depiction of the Virgin there, got her arms crossed over her chest. Manuscript in Ethiopia, so the Jesuits, by the way, went to Ethiopia, went to India, they came back to Ethiopia, they brought images with them the whole way around. They brought European images, they brought images from India back to Ethiopia. So there's a lot of exchange going on at this time period. We're talking of this period here I have on the screen. This manuscript here is a copy of the Miracles of Mary, a very important and kind of particularly Ethiopian text. You have the figure of the Virgin, again, standing with her arms crossed. Now, I'm sure you're going, well, yeah, duh. Not duh, because before this time, the Virgin is shown seated in Ethiopian manuscripts. She's shown not in that pose at all. She's holding the Christ child, that sort of thing. When you see this connection here, this visual connection, I think this is kind of the smoking gun of what was happening and that we know was happening in terms of travel. These images are traveling as well between Ethiopia and the Indian subcontinent. Getting more into the modern period, and read the end of the show, I promise. We've got this idea of what happened later in Ethiopia's history, and I was going to kind of stop with the Jesuits and with Gondar, which becomes the capital of Ethiopia for a long time, and where Ethiopian kings kind of come to the fore again, start commissioning a lot of manuscripts, a lot of icons, but we really need to get to the present day, and how do we get there? So we reach some kind of not so great periods in Ethiopia's history, starting in the 19th century, where Ethiopia starts to be noticed by other folks, and not in a really positive way. So we have forces that attempt to come in to colonize Ethiopia. One great point of pride in Africa and for Ethiopians is that Ethiopia was never colonized. It was occupied in the 20th century by the Italians, but never ever colonized. And so this section of the show will talk about those attempts of, for example, this is showing the 19th century Battle of Adwa, which happened in sort of northeastern Ethiopia. And you've got the Ethiopian troops on the left here fighting against the Italians. And actually right at the top is St. George, who is the patron saint of Ethiopia and who is watching over this whole battle and allowing for the Ethiopians to win this particular battle and to kick the Italians out the first time. This is the first Italian war in Ethiopia. So this section will kind of talk about that. And then we will get to the 20th, 21st century, where we're sort of looking towards the history of Haile Selassie. We actually have, I don't have a picture here, we actually own one of Haile Selassie's robes at the Walters. So we will show that. That's never been on view before. And just talking about his role on the global stage, really reaching out in terms of diplomacy and reaching out to really all regions, and also morphing into things like Rastafarianism, which is one of these impacts of Ethiopia moving outward into places like Jamaica and so forth, and we'll have some representation of that as well. So just to conclude, I just couldn't resist showing a few sort of travel photos from where this exhibition has taken me and how important it's been to see the places from which all this comes. As Simon mentioned, we have great funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the International Center of Medieval Art and the Crest Foundation to actually, for me, that's me in the black hat, I know, a little bit of a transformation, but then over there, with our head of paintings conservation, Karen French from the Walters. She started working at the Walters when African Zion was up in our galleries, and so she's had a long-standing relationship working with Ethiopian art at the museum. And so we traveled to Ethiopia. Those are the Simeon Mountains I mentioned before, that kind of Grand Canyon type space in northern Ethiopia. Obviously Lalibela. There's a stele from Aksum. That's again the early capital of, beginning with, King Ndubis, but also King Azana in northern Ethiopia. And the reason why we went in January of 2020 was because that is when the big Feast of Timkat takes place. This is basically, they call it the Feast of the Epiphany, but in fact it's celebrating Christ's baptism. And so on that occasion, this is actually showing Gondar. I mentioned Gondar. This is the royal bath in Gondar from the dates to the 17th century. And beginning about 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody sort of gathers around this bath, and all the priests and deacons gather around the bath sort of on the lowest level, right immediately at the water. There's incredible chanting, singing, music that goes on for hours, and as the sun rises, that's the climax of the liturgy, and the young boys from the town jump into the bath, sort of reenacting Christ's baptism. I don't think he leaped into the water, but you never know. Anyway, it's an incredible experience, and really to see the liturgy in action, to see some of the objects being used. So all these priests are actually holding staffs that they use to sort of as a percussive device, in addition to being able to hold themselves up because they're standing for hours. Sistra, these rattles, which you have one of here at the Museum of Russian Icons, and we'll have two in the exhibition. This kind of brought it all together, I think, for both Karen and me. We were able to visit the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, which is an incredible repository for church icons, but in Addis Ababa. It's a functioning museum. This is us in storage looking at another Fidei Seon diptych, very much like ours at the Walters. That's me and Karen with our colleagues from Ethiopia. And the National Library also has some incredible early manuscripts. That's the keeper of the manuscripts there on the right-hand side. And also meet some living artists practicing their art and thinking about Ethiopian, past Ethiopian art as well. Tedesse Mesfin and Addis Gazayan. The market for the Ethiopian contemporary art has really taken off, so get it while you can. And just incredible to meet these folks. And Tedesse is actually has been a teacher at the art school in Addis Ababa for many decades. He's just retired, so he's trained many of the artists who are working today, out in the art world. And he is out there too, but he's trained many of those artists. And just to close, to say and to reiterate that the exhibition is starting at the Walters in December. I hope we can all see you there. It's running into March of next year. And it is traveling on to, if you can't make it to Baltimore, hope you can, it's traveling on to the Peabody Essex Museum just up the road in Salem. I know it might seem far away. That's what my Boston friends tell me. They're like, Salem? I'm like, yes, Salem. It's a fantastic museum, and they actually have over 500 Ethiopian objects in their collection. Who knew? I didn't even know. So they will have about 20 of their objects in the exhibition, and then it will travel on to the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio. So please tell all your friends, all your family in all these places. I hope you come out to see it, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christine. That was amazing.
Thanks,
And
Melanie. Thank you.
To borrow a metaphor from the modern Ethiopian American artist, you've shown us that and the gold beneath. We're really excited about, and Salem is really not that far away. I'll be excited to go. So we'll open it up to a little Q&A now. If you have some, I'll come around and.
I'm Ronald Smith, the research fellow here at the museum.
I remember you from the symposium. Yes. Hi, how are you?
Tenestily.
He's good.
This is a fantastic survey of Ethiopian art. I love it. And it's an auspicious one for bringing knowledge about art of Ethiopia and surrounding areas. And it's great as an introduction to the series dedicated to Kim. I have a small anecdote and then a question. When I was a professor at Northwestern, I shared an office with Abraham Demos, who was the dean of Addis Ababa University. And his wife, Aster, an ethnomusicologist, who had a brother who was an iconographer. I'm going to make a connection. And the question I have is the first slide that you had of the series of texts in the Queen Sheba. There's nothing like that I can think of in Russian art. There are remnants of this in so-called Vita icons.
Yes.
But that's about all I can think of. And the one that we had from the Andrei Lubyov a few years back had at most 3 series on the top and on the sides. These are just boxes of the Russians call klemo. Klemos are a perfect way of representing narratives. And the biblical texts have why so many narratives. Why is it that Russia does not have this genre of painting?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking before you said it, I mean, these feel to me, the format's slightly different, but it is kind of like a Vita icon, right? I mean, and I want to make the point too here that this is, a 20th century example. Now, I've made arguments elsewhere that Ethiopian art really relies in a lot of ways on what I call serial imagery. So this is a perfect example of that, but much earlier, they have a particular genre of illumination and a type of manuscript called a stencil. It's essentially a chain manuscript, and it's like a concertina, like an accordion folded manuscript. And when you unfold it, you have these little square scenes, one after the other. Sometimes they're narrative, sometimes it's just saint this, saint that, saint this, saint that, until you get to Mary at the very end, usually with Saint George. And also some of the manuscript illumination that you see in codex form, in book form also, you get these kind of serial types of images. So that's kind of, I think that's a long-standing, it's a long-standing kind of technique and composition in Ethiopia. But I wouldn't be too concerned that Russia doesn't have this, because this particular way is a very new, sort of, you don't have quite this in earlier Ethiopian art. And I think the same thing can be happening in some ways. It's just that this is arranged in a way that it's very, I mean, to my modern mind, it looks like a comic strip, right? You can just read it along. So don't ask me why Ethiopic is read from left to right when it's a Semitic language. Don't ask me that question. I haven't figured that out yet. But this is how you read the language, and this is how you read the composition here. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes. Oh, I was just waiting on the mic, I think. Yeah.
Hi, that
Hi.
was a lot of rapid information. I don't know if I caught it all.
Yeah.
In today's Ethiopia, is there Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people? Do they all get along good?
Yeah, I mean, actually the current problem right now is different ethnicities not getting along well. So even within the single Ethiopian Orthodox Church, don't even get me started, there's a lot of breakdown, unfortunately, happening right now. So the largest, the most practiced religion in Ethiopia is Christianity, followed by not too much less, by Muslims, and then Ethiopian Jews, there's really very, very few, and they're all, like I said, in these various campaigns, been airlifted out to Israel. And when you go to, for example, just outside of Gondar, that's where a lot of Ethiopian Jews originally lived. There are still these little sort of craft villages where you can go and you can see some of the artworks that Ethiopian Jews traditionally created, but they're actually made by Christians today. So, and they are running these workshops where they make ceramics, basketry. Those are sort of the two big things. So we'll have some examples of those in the exhibition. So, yeah, I think there has been a relative harmony of those religions in Ethiopia. But again, I think what we're seeing today is really, it's an ethnic breakdown because there's dozens of ethnic groups within Ethiopia. I mentioned Amharic, that comes from the Amhara group, and that's a large ethnic group in Ethiopia, but there's the Oromo, there's the Tigrayans, that's where the conflict a few months ago, a full year ago, started in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And so to answer your question, I think there's always going to be some sort of conflict, but yes, those religions did coexist for a very long time, yeah.
Now, one more question. Now, did the Jewish and the Ethiopians intermarry? And then what was before all the three religions? What do they have for religion before that?
Yeah, so I don't know if you heard her question. She was asking if Ethiopian Jews, Ethiopian Christians intermarried. What was there before Judaism, I guess, right? So I think there were the faiths that relied more on sort of nature and things of that sort. We have some of those religions in the southern part of Ethiopia today as well. So I should say even today. I don't know that there was a lot of intermarrying, but what I can say is that even Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, it has a lot of similarities. They take a lot of Jewish customs. So they actually have both a Saturday and a Sunday Sabbath. They also adhere to some of the same dietary rules. And so there's a lot of connections there with Judaism, more so than other types of Christianity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm Rua Donnelly, a trustee
Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Welcome, Christine. I notice a fascination with the iconic image of the cross in some of your slides, and particularly elaborate interlace, kind of fascinating, mesmerizing image of a cross that's broken down into many crosses.
Yeah.
I understood that some of those images are considered magical by the Ethiopians, and I wondered if you could comment on the hidden magic of these images in your show.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you might be referring to this, but one of the genres of Ethiopian art that I did not show but will be in the exhibition are their healing scrolls. Now these are long scrolls, parchment scrolls that are commissioned by individuals to take care of various ailments they might have, and they are often inscribed with images of the cross, actually, and they are produced by men known as dabtara. So they're part of the Ethiopian church, but they're not ordained priests, and so they kind of are in this liminal area between, the prayers on these scrolls are ultimately coming usually from the Bible, But also the Dabtara refer to these manuals they have, these sort of, that you give the Dabtara your name and your birthday, and he does calculations and looks through this book and finds the most effective imagery for your scroll. And so sometimes those scrolls are referred to as magic scrolls because he does have this sort of shaman role to him. But this is a very common practice in Ethiopia. We know it went back to at least the 15th century because King Zara Yacob was really annoyed by this because he was a very, very much imposing Christianity, and he was like, we can't have this scroll business. But the ones that we have today mostly are from the 18th, 19th, 20th century is the one that survived, but it's a much older tradition. And those do incorporate the sign of the cross. So I wonder if that's maybe what you might be thinking of. You're like, no, that's not what I'm thinking of. I'm not super aware of the actual processional crosses and hand crosses as having a sort of magical meaning in an Ethiopian context. But I can say, it's pretty ubiquitous image, right? So it does creep into, the sort of icon art, but also into other areas of life in Ethiopia. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Matthias Waschek, Worcester Art Museum. Your talk was amazing. And
Thank you.
You probably have lots of people making the pilgrimage from Massachusetts to Baltimore to see the exhibition before it comes to Salem. You said something that I found really fascinating, that tradespeople from Ethiopia went to Europe and got religious artifacts to back home, and that they didn't bring religious artifacts from themselves. The way, and it dovetails with, my hypothesis dovetails with the question that Ruud, I think, asked. It talks also, there's an implication of the status of these religious artifacts, because if they're not intrinsically holy, they can travel. Whereas if there is an intrinsic sacredness, it might be a different thing. And I remember, for instance, at one point the Louvre had one gallery, not of Ethiopian icons, but of Eastern European icons, and that gallery needed to be blessed. Whereas no priest would bless a gallery of Baroque paintings or so.
Sure, yeah.
Could you tell a little bit about the status of those icons? And that gets to this magic part that Rua was asking.
So the status of the icons that came back to Ethiopia, is that what you mean?
The status of the icons
or the ones
Ethiopia.
in Ethiopia. Now, I don't mean to indicate, again, I wish I had Verena here, but I don't mean to indicate that they did not bring any religious objects with them. I just think that they realized that what was going to be a really good gift for the Europeans who already had these, icons and religious objects were going to be those raw materials that they knew that they wanted and that they had, So I don't know that they didn't travel outwards. That is something when I first started working on this project and I was thinking about, how can we really pinpoint the impact of Ethiopian art? Can we find, objects from Ethiopia that we know to have exited very early on, not in the modern era of collecting, but earlier on? I did not come across a lot of that, but what I can say, this is not a sacred act, but those coins, those Oxamite coins that I mentioned, they were actually in India. There were forgeries made of those Oxamite coins contemporary with the Oxamite coins being created, these early forgeries. So again, that's kind of showing the great impact of these things and the respect for the coinage of the Oxamite Empire, enough to have forgeries made of them in India. So I don't know that this is something we've talked about a lot because, for example, when I was at the Getty, we did the Icon Sinai show. And while the galleries were not blessed, we did have Greek Orthodox priests come in, perform a ceremony, and I know that here I learned that this museum has been blessed, so I feel extra blessed to be in this space. And so I have a community advisory group which actually contains 2 priests from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in our DMV area. They have not asked for the space to be blessed, because we have wondered about that as well. but we are prepared for those objects to have that function and that aspect today in the gallery space, which is obviously not actually a sacred space. I don't remember reading anything in particular that the icons can't be removed from Ethiopia because of their sacredness or anything like that. I think they did travel and the manuscripts traveled. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but yeah.
It does.
Yeah, okay.
Basically what I'm understanding is it's much more complicated than what I was implying in my question.
I made it even more complicated.
Thank you. Another question.
Was Christianity in Ethiopia, for lack of a better term, policed in a way comparable to Christianity in Western Europe or even Eastern Europe? And actually, I don't have a generalization about the comparison between Western European policing, citing heretics, going to purge people, revolutions. I don't know how much it happened in Russia compared to, say, Western Europe or Central Europe, but then my real question is, were things a little less intense and punitive and punishing and defining in Ethiopia, or were they about the same?
Oh.
The reason I'm asking that is if there were these, I think these like long picture things to me compared to the shorter picture things the gentleman was talking about earlier, I think if you're willing to give your people these long picture things, that gives them a chance to tell themselves more stories about it than with the short picture things. But I don't know. I mean, were there heretics in Ethiopia and like, oh, you're a bad Ethiopian?
So my favorite heretic is Stephanos, who was a monk who tried to reform. He felt that Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, this is going to the 15th century, he felt that it was getting too far sort of from the truth. We had Sciacca at that time, I mentioned him before, the king, who was really promoting Christianity from the state's standpoint. He was requiring all churches to have icons of Mary, which had never been a thing in Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. And Stephanos really felt like this is getting too far from, Christianity as we know it. And he got in a lot of trouble. So there were more things like that between the state, which was very much at that time a Christian state, and the church. Some of that back and forth happened. So the Christian church being controlled from the king, as well as the patriarch, of course. But but again, the patriarch was in Alexandria, so kind of the king was kind of on the ground and keeping everybody kind of in line for quite some time. So yeah, I mean, I didn't quite answer your question, but I mean, this particular painting, even though it's celebrating a very old Ethiopian history, this kind of painting, which is large, in fact, is made for the tourist market. So this is not considered a Christian story, really, even though it kind of is sort of. I mean, it's the origins of Judaism and Christianity in Ethiopia, right? But it's not really being used for that purpose. It's not it's not made for Christians in Ethiopia. So did I answer your question a little bit? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Quick question about the iconography. So, are there any written manuscripts or books of painting they were following, or they go back to the Greek ones? So
for something like this? I love how everyone loves this thing. This was in our storage for years and years and years. Everyone's like, oh, but it's really fun and it's really quite impactful. So I didn't tell you what the name of the story was. I said that this story of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon was written down first in the 13th century. And so that's what they were looking back to. It's called the Kebre Nagust in Ethiopic. So it's the glory of kings. And it's not just the story of Sheba and Solomon. It goes through several other kings as well. But this is the most famous part of that story. So that, I think, is what, I mean, this is a story that goes back way before the 13th century, obviously. So it's an oral tradition that was known and continued to be known in Ethiopia up through the 20th century. Your average artist was probably not reading the Kebre Nagust in its original, as Ethiopic, right? So it's coming partly from the oral tradition, but also they had ultimately that text to go back to. What you don't find is real precedents for this imagery. So they are coming up with this just by reading or knowing the story. Yeah.
So a second question, or maybe an after question. I'm talking not just about this one, but about some icons you showed us.
I'm going to bring some icons up so we don't get confused.
Are there any written iconographic or strange manuscript where it said that the Virgin has always have blue on top, and so this type of which in Eastern icons there were manuscripts circulated only within the closed circle of iconographers.
Right. No. My answer is no. That's a short answer. No, not that I know of. This is a tradition that is very much maintained. Sometimes you will get sort of unusual colors or whatever, but the Virgin wears blue. I think the iconographers knew that the Virgin, wears blue and so forth. Like I said, she shows up in some other colors, but yeah, I don't know of any written artistic treatises, if that's what you're asking for, in the Ethiopic tradition. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Meredith.
So you showed us some really great images, and I couldn't help but notice that so many of them came from the Walters. But I know that you've been working hard to secure lands internationally and nationally. So I would love to hear a little bit about kind of where the limitations of the Walters collection were and how you worked on the scope of the loans, and especially the international loans. What did you need to go get, and how did you sort of make that a 250-piece show?
Yeah, so I mean, it really boils down to the reason why the Walters started collecting Ethiopian art, not having much of an African art collection beyond that, because that was not an interest of our founders, Henry and William. The collecting first happened, like I said, just before 1993, the early 90s, by our former director, Gary Vicon, who some of you might be familiar with. He was a Byzantinist himself, still is, I mean, he's still around. And he was also the medieval art curator before he became director. So he started working on the idea of African Zion, thinking about the Ethiopian art, really the Christian objects in relationship to other Ethiopian Orthodox religions, other Eastern Orthodox religions, that are very well represented, for example, in this museum. So we already had Russian icons, we already had Byzantine icons and ivories and so forth. So it was very much seen as if we collect the Christian art of Ethiopia, which is incredibly beautiful and certainly museum quality, we will be able to sort of complement what we already have. So that's where the Walters kind of stops. So I was able to supplement by including some of our Armenian things, our Roman coins, things of that sort. That's where I could sort of grow it from the Walters end. But anything, for example, those images I showed you from the British Museum, I needed to bring in the Islamic Ethiopian art, the Jewish Ethiopian art, to talk about the art of the south of Ethiopia. We don't have anything like those Khonso figures. So that was where, that's where the loans come in. Now, we have also been working with institutions in Ethiopia to borrow some objects from Ethiopia. This, as you might imagine, is incredibly complicated. We're kind of at a pinch point right now. I need the prayers of everybody in this room that they come. We are working very hard to also borrow some of these objects from Ethiopia, specifically mostly a bunch of icons from the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. I showed you us there looking at storage, and also I think 1 or 2 crosses as well. I think it's really important to show the incredible richness of the art that's still in Ethiopia, but it's a very complicated moment, and it's very difficult to secure loans like that. So it requires a lot of agreement from government, from the museum, from the university under which the museum sits. So it's all these levels of things, but. I think it's important to partner with institutions in Africa, and to so we're trying everything we can to, I'm on the phone like 3 days a week with Ethiopia, like 6 o'clock in the morning. I need my loans, please. It's in progress, but yeah. So this is some of what we've been doing to kind of flesh out what we have at the Walters and to really tell a much bigger picture of Ethiopia. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll give a last
Oh,
question
wait.
to Simon.
One more question, Simon. That's for you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. My name is Denis Kritimsky. This question is prompted by a question which was asked before me about the existence of the canon, how the particular image should be drawn. In the Ethiopic culture, for example, this Virgin and the Child, the triptych, would it be treated more like an illustration of Biblic story or an object of worship?
Yeah. Well, I have another question that I still don't quite have an answer to. I don't know if anybody in this room can answer it for me. It is absolutely an object of worship. Just a little anecdote, and this is getting back to the question we had before from Matthias about blessing the spaces of museums and things of that sort. I was able to, we have the Walters parking lot. We have several of our employees are Ethiopian, and they often don't realize that right next door we have Ethiopian art in our building. So it's been my personal sort of quest to let them know that. And a couple of years ago, I brought in Talila, one of our attendants, to see the Ethiopian art in our galleries, and I showed him that Fere Seon icon on the wall. It's quite big, that one. It was part of a diptych originally, but it's about this big by this big. It's quite big. And I brought him in front of this specifically because, it's made by an Ethiopian artist in Ethiopia. And he said to me, I can't look at this with my whole eyes. So these are very much, religious icons, and they have that power. Now, I say icon, but there is a debate in the scholarly community studying these things, mostly by Western scholars, that you can't actually call this an icon, but it doesn't have the same function as it would, say, in the Byzantine or Greek church or the Russian church. Now, I'm going to ask for all your help because you know all this material far better than I do. My understanding is that in those contexts, I can't speak for Ethiopia just yet, is that icon, it's not just an image, right? It's embodying that Mary or that St. George or whomever. So what I am trying to get to the bottom of is to get the real answer. Is that how it functions in the Ethiopian context? It's absolutely a sacred object, but is that, is the essence of that holy person in that icon? So does that answer your question?
It's very close.
Okay. It's adjacent to your question.
Thank you. Wow. This is incredible.
Thank you.
Christine, thank you so much. This is absolutely brilliant, and a brilliant first Kent Russell lecture. Yeah. Absolutely. I was just thinking, there are two types of talks, and the one type is the talks that are very interesting, and you think, well, they were very interesting, but a little bit too long. And there's another group that is, it's a minority, that is, you're listening, this is so interesting, keep on talking, go on. And you're just like that, Christine. You are just, I have a feeling we are, scratching the surface. There's so much to tell. Yeah. There's still so much to discover. What a fascinating world. Thank you so much, and I think that we all, we'll have to go now to and see your exhibition. Thanks again. You're all most welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.